Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending the third International Conference on Integrated Natural Resources and Environment Management. I'm here to share some of the findings that my colleagues and I were passionate into in terms of estimating the ecosystem services provided by the Balanac and Santa Cruz watersheds of Laguna, particularly the sediment yield of the existing land use. Now, before I proceed, please allow me to introduce our very passionate team for their efforts. So, this team is made up of yours truly. My name is Carl Ureta, and I am postdoctoral fellow from Clemson University. With me is Ms. Jameline Traspalacio, which is a PhD candidate from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. With us also is with Dr. Nico Anastasio, a university researcher from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Also, we have Ms. Joanne Ureta. She's a PhD candidate also from Clemson University. And Ms. Ana Del Sapugay, which is a development specialist from De La Salle University. So just a little bit about us. Our group began simply as curious friends talking about what possible impactful research we can contribute for the community. Since most of us were alumni of the School of Environmental Science and Management from UPLB, we were interested at looking into sustainable development research. Now, one of the key things that we noticed is that there are very few research about quantifying ecosystem services in the country, considering that innovative ecosystem service-based models are now becoming available. Hence, we embarked on a hashtag quest to quantify the ecosystem services and trade-offs in selected watersheds in the area. So quantifying ecosystem services and the potential trade-offs have become a growing niche for research around the world. It generates crucial information which can be used as supporting data for crafting sustainable management plans, conservation strategies, disaster risk reduction plans, and addressing climate change impacts. Particularly for this study, I will be focusing on the sediment yield of the landscape and how it relates to water quality improvement. So quantifying sediment yield are important as it reveals information about potential soil erosion, which could eventually end up being deposited to streams and rivers and make them silted. Furthermore, the sediments also carries other particulate matter that can be detrimental to the water chemistry of streams and rivers and eventually contributing to the decline in water quality and increase in cost of water quality improvement. Now, the changes in sediment yields are driven by complex interaction between topography, climate, and land use, such that changes in land use and land management have highly nonlinear effects. This is a study claimed by Allen in 2004 and Jurgel et al. In 2002. Also, by Hamel, Chaplin, Kramer, Sim, and Mueller in 2015, they said that understanding the service of sediment retention provided by the natural landscapes is therefore a major priority for landscape managers. To add to the complexity, GOPEDSA actually claimed that erosion and sediment delivery happens at varying spatial scales. Thus, it is very challenging and expensive to measure actual data by manually collecting measurements in the field extensively. Now, since it is difficult to quantify soil erosion on a large scale, the use of soil erosion models has been a means to come up with regional and national estimates, according to Marquis in 2021. Now, various models have been developed to model soil erosion with the help of GIS and remote sensing products, according to the study of the Rakshan, Babae et al. In 2021. Now, such models also include the Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-off, or INVEST. Now, what is INVEST? INVEST is a package of modules for various ecosystem service-based models developed by the Natural Capital Project, housed within the Stanford University. Now, one of these modules is the Sediment Delivery Ratio Model, or the SDR model. Now, the aim of that model, the SDR model, is to map and quantify the sediment delivery and retention services of the landscape. The model is fully distributed and GIS-based, accepting inputs or rasters of climate, soil, topography, and land use and land cover data. However, so our team, having explored this possibility of using INVEST, found out that although the model has been used widely in different countries, there's little to none that used or applied the model within the Philippines. Most of the models used in the Philippines are usually just in carbon, but not in sediment delivery ratio model. So, therefore, we took it upon ourselves to come up with this research to quantify the sediment yield of the selected watersheds, namely Balanac and Santa Cruz. The main objective of our research is to quantify the amount of sediments being exported and retained by each land cover type in Balanac and Santa Cruz watersheds through the INVEST sediment delivery ratio model. So this shows the overview of how the model works. Now, primarily, the model uses the revised soil loss equation applied to specific pixel of interest, considering the soil erodibility factor, which is a factor of soil type, isoerosivity, which is a factor of rainfall, slope length gradient factor, crop coefficient factor, which is the ratio of soil loss under a specific crop, and support practice factor, which is the ratio of soil loss considering potential support practices in a given land cover. Now, the RUSLE is a standard soil loss equation for estimating soil erosion. The estimated RUSLE in a pixel was subjected to the SDR at that specific pixel, considering the potential sediment yield that will be received from upstream pixels and the potential sediment that could be released to the downstream pixel, hence representing the connectivity. So the result of the SDR actually is a net sediment export, which estimates the total amount of sediments being released to the streams, considering the present land cover at this specific pixel. Furthermore, the model also estimates the amount of sediments being retained by the land cover by computing for the sediment export with and without its present land cover. So overall, the sediments exported and sediments retained are the overall potential sediment yield that can be generated by the specific land cover at that specific pixel. Note that the sediment yield have direct implication to water quality. High sediment export could lead to a declining water quality, while high sediment retention could potentially improve or sustain the water quality. So these are the data set that was needed to run the SDR model of INVEST. Notice that most data are raster files, are globally acquired, and publicly available. Since most are global dataset, the resolution of the SDR analysis conforms to a 30 meter by 30 meter resolution, or a 900 square meter per pixel, but we resampled it into 100 square meter per pixel, or 10 meter by 10 meter, to accommodate more detailed analysis within the watershed. So we focused our study in Balanac and Santa Cruz watershed since we were able to get better data for analysis in these watersheds. Now, Balanac and Santa Cruz watershed lies around the Mount Banahal-San Cristobal protected landscape. Primarily, both watershed are prime agricultural areas planted with highly valid crops such as rice, coconut, corn, vegetables, rambutan, lanzones, etc. So the watersheds are also a substantial source of water, particularly for Mahayhay, Liliw, and Nagcarlan. Needless to say that water-related ecosystem services in the area are of utmost importance. So what some of the results of our study? So in both watershed, majority of the land cover type using the official 2015 land cover map classified as perennial crop, followed by forest in Santa Cruz, while annual crop in Balanac. Notice that most of the forested areas are highly concentrated only on the upland area. Also, note that the built-up areas consist only 4% of the overall land cover between the two watershed. Considering this small amount, it will play a significant role in the succeeding findings. Alright, so these are the photos taken about agricultural activities present in the watershed, some of the photos at least. So we did a quick land cover change analysis from 2010 land cover map to 2015, which suggests that there had been a significant increase in the perennial crop area. While some of this may be associated with simply reclassification, since there had been a bit of discrepancy between land covers. However, the spike in perennial crops are still substantial and worthy of looking. Now, focusing on the non-vegetated areas, we have here, particularly the built-up area, it is clear that there had been an increase in the built-up land cover area. We can note that it's very small, but it will play a significant role later on. All right, so the result of the model, particularly for the sediment export. Let's look at the Santa Cruz watershed. Now, the total annual sediment export estimated around 2 million tons for the overall landscape of Santa Cruz watershed. Primarily, the results show that this comes from the perennial crops, followed by the built-up area. Considering the land area coverage of the perennial crops and built-up areas, the large amount of sediments from perennial crops could be associated to the vastness of its area coverage. However, for the built-up area, considering the small area coverage of its land cover, it still exports that much amount of sediments. This can also be seen in the mean sediment export per hectare, where built-up areas shows to have the highest sediment export potential. Similarly, in the case of Balanac watershed, which exports also almost similar amount of total sediments overall, the perennial crops also dominated majority of the sediment export. Again, this could be associated to its coverage. Furthermore, while the built-up area exports sediments lower than the perennial crops, it is still substantial considering the very little coverage area it has in this watershed. The mean sediment export also shows consistently that the export potential of the built-up area remains to be the highest among the land covers. Now, overall, in both watershed, results show that the two land covers that are of main concern that exports most of the sediments are the perennial crop and the built-up area. A small portion of the barren, open land cover area also showed the potential sediment export capacity of other non-vegetated areas, which could be considerably high. All right, in terms of sediment retention, looking at the Santa Cruz watershed again, we have overall the sediments estimate could reach up to 52 million tons. So this is the amount of sediments that's being held in place by the landscape. So the sediments retained are primarily provided by the perennial crops, followed by the forested areas, then other vegetated areas. While the perennial cropland provide most retention capacity, this again could be due to its vastness, since its land area coverage is also the majority. However, if we look at the mean sediment retention per hectare, we can see that while the perennial crop also provides substantial service, other vegetated areas also contribute significantly, particularly the forested areas, and then we have the shrubland and even the grassland. Similar observation actually can be found for the Balanac watershed, where perennial crops provide most of the retention service. However, this time it is supplemented by the annual crop. The forest land cover also contributes just a very small amount of retention service since its area coverage is just very small. However, looking at the mean contribution per area, notice that vegetated areas consistently provide substantial contribution. Particularly for the forested areas here, we can see, considering that it's very small area coverage, its sediment retention performance is still quite impressive. So overall, in both watershed, the sediment retention capacity of the landscape lies within the vegetated areas. And generally, non-vegetated areas performs least in terms of ecosystem service provision, at least for the sediment yield. So what can we conclude from these findings? Now, looking at the ratio of the total sediment export versus sediment retained by the land cover, and considering the total sediment yield that can be potentially produced by the landscape, we can see that in both cases, majority of the exporting land covers are the non-vegetated areas. You can see here. So that includes built-up areas, which is the red, and the barren areas. So this raises actually a case where, although expanding built-up areas, which is normally associated to urbanization and industrial conversion, could signify actually economic growth, one has to also consider its potential effect to the ecosystem. While this case only emphasized the sediment yield of the landscape, this can have direct implication to the water quality of the watershed, which eventually affects health, water use, irrigation, and even potential hydropower prospects. A declining water quality could increase cost, which eventually could also catch up to the potential economic gain of the region. So some key highlights before I end the discussion. We see here that vegetated areas provide best water quality ecosystem services. And the small amount of forest land area coverage actually provide large amount of ecosystem service, particularly for water quality improvement. And also, the agricultural areas, either perennial or annual cropland, could play significant roles for ecosystem service provisions. Therefore, soil conservation measures and sustainable farming practices are imperative, particularly in these watersheds since majority of the area are agricultural areas. Now, while the expansion of built-up areas could signify economic improvement, careful and sustainable planning must be conducted considering its potential effect to the ecosystem and its services to human well-being. Maraming salamat po. And this is Quest, or Quantifying Ecosystem Services and Trade-off team. Thank you.